Thanks, Mark. Nice to be here. The paper I'm presenting, I guess, well, I was already writing that before the conference was announced, but I guess it goes to the heart of the topic that we're discussing over these days. The relation between monetary integration and the current crisis that we have, and democracy. So, and very much, what does the handling of the crisis and the options that we have before us leave of EU democracy? And it's striking that democratic concerns have not been very prominent in the kind of measures that have been taken so far. There's a single article in the Fiscal Compact, which is not very helpful. And if you read the interim report of the Van Rompuy group, then you also find that, again, they're not making much progress on that front, unless on some of the other dossiers. So basically what I do in this paper is to provide a kind of theoretical framework to consider the strategic options available. I introduce three models that loosely map on the famous political trilemma of the world economy as developed by Daniel Roderick. That again builds on three key values. So on the one hand we have monetary integration, which in a way I guess is a value by now, which we want to preserve. On the other hand there's the value of democracy, which most people I guess will recognize to be a value. And then there's a mediating thing, diversity, which I think is quite prominent, and I think it's bound to come back to us several times these days. Why is diversity important here? For a couple of reasons. Some of them are normative. So diversity is the way the expression of nation-state autonomy within the European Union. The fact that maybe different nation-states have different traditions, different ways of doing things, face different challenges, have different political dynamics. So the preservation of the diversity expressed by nation-states in the European Union has a certain claim to value as well. For allowing for proximity of decisions being taken close to the citizens, as the saying goes, relatively high responsiveness that can be attained at the national level, accountability, experimentation. Of course, these things also apply to lower levels, even to regional levels, local levels. But the nation state seems to be a very good vehicle for these things. What's just as important is that there's marked diversity in economic terms between different European nation states. In the economic structure, in the key sectors, in the growth they experience, in the level of the GDP, in the business cycle, the way it evolves. Of course, there are parallels there, but there are also marked differences. In the trade balance, certainly. And what's even more important in this context is that since EMU was introduced, let me put it mildly, there has not been very consistent evidence of convergence in these respects, in these economic respects, as much as convergence was premised. We needed criteria for convergence, but I don't think the evidence is anywhere consistent in that direction. What's maybe even more important, there we move close to the issue of democracy, is political diversity. You have different ways of doing things, different models of democracy, different models of socio-economic governance. We have different political preferences, different political majorities. So diversity is, there is something to be cherished in diversity as it is expressed and conveyed by the nation states that we have. And that value has to be delineated from the value of democracy, which we've effectively realized at the national level with certain electoral institutions. And most people in Europe will say that the nation state is indeed effectively democratic, even if it may be in very different ways in very different countries. Whether we have something similar at the European level stands to be demonstrated, I think. Of course, we mimic certain institutional practices. In certain institutions, we have elections, we have certain forms of accountability. But, and here, I guess I even rely on the early Bundesverfassungsgericht. There lack certain contextual conditions that make the operation of democracy at the European level fully convincing in a way, fully legitimate. Stability is one thing, trust in institutions, stability, recognizability of institutions. An integrated public sphere or a demos, if you like, and effective political contestation, the development of systematic political options in the party context. Now, so there you have these three values. Let's see how they've done so far. I think if you start from these three values, then you can actually appreciate that the original design of EMU, of course it's easy to criticize it now, but it has a rationale. And I think one way to understand it and to appreciate why monetary integration was asymmetric, why there was monetary integration but not much of systematic economic integration, is to appreciate that the value of diversity weighed in that decision. So on the one hand, yes, there is monetary integration. We have exclusive supranational competences in monetary policy. The exchange rate is fixed at a central level. There's, interest rates are governed from Frankfurt. That leads to increased transnational economic interdependencies. But at the same time, the Stability and Growth Pact was designed in a way to allow for diversity. It only provided a framework. And it left much of national policy discretion. And I think as a complement to that, the whole one way to understand the no bailout provision is really to leave responsibility also. So with discretion, democratic room for appreciation at the national level came also national responsibility. We are not going to bail each other out. You are responsible for your own financial situation. Now that was, of course, as we know now, a very vulnerable setup. So what you see, of course, and I don't have to record the story, with the sovereign debt crisis, national governments could no longer depreciate the national currencies, were locked into the euro, and at the same time there were increased interdependencies. And of course, we could, on the one hand, not afford to let Greece fall because of the cascading threat that it would spill over to other countries and that the euro as a whole would implode. But on the other hand, initially, we also had very limited means to rescue it. And in a way, this was prohibited by the no bailout clause. So basically, the solution is a kind of loan packages on the basis of conditionality, policy contract, but at the same time, what we've seen is an increase of mutual distrust and loss of political autonomy for the debtor states. I mean, is Greece still a sovereign country? I'm sure if they had a Bundesverfassungsgericht in Athens or somewhere nearby, it probably would find that key core national competences were deeply violated. But somehow the Bundesverfassungsgericht only rules for one country and does not consider the fate of the others. Right, so what's the situation now? What are the options? Well, as I said, it maps very nicely on this political dilemma. Some of you may know it, some of you may not know it. Roddick puts up that we have three values: hyperglobalization, the nation state, autonomy, and democratic politics. And you can have two, but with choosing two, you lose the third. And the classical situation with, say, what was called embedded liberalism was that we didn't have yet, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, much of hyperglobalization. So we had independent, autonomous nation states and democratic politics. But then globalization kicked in, and we moved more into a situation where what he calls a scenario of the golden straitjacket, where globalization limits the maneuver of nation states. It gives them power still to negotiate agreements externally, but the domestic options are reduced, and in that sense, democratic politics gets reduced. And the only way, theoretically, to overcome that would really be to re-establish democratic politics not at the national level, but at the global level. Which means that you can have democratic politics in a globalized world, but only by abolishing the nation state. So these are the three options. Now, this it's very easy to in a way transform this into the political dilemma of the Eurozone. So let's replace hyperglobalization by monetary union. Basically what it does is it also increases interdependencies. And in that sense exposes national economies to each other in an increased manner. The scenarios change then as well, of course. So the scenario that I would argue that is prevailing at this moment is indeed the combination of nation-state controls. Mercosi, it was called a year ago still. Nation-state controls and sticking to monetary union. But as you the logic of the trilemma goes, democratic politics is the likely victim. So the alternative one is actually, which may be associated with somebody like Jürgen Habermas these days, let's move forward, let's save democracy at the cost of the nation state. And then, of course, there's always a third scenario, which says this was a bad idea from the start, let's get rid of that monetary union and regain the nation state, national control, and national democratic politics. Let me develop those scenarios a bit for you. So, executive federalism, that's of course also a term by Habermas, I think it's appropriately called federal in the sense that we see increased central policy coordination, more powers being shifted to Europe, but at the same time, what you also see, and I think that's also been hinted at, is that these are ever more hard to kind of harmonize. What you see is that more and more the coordination is individualized, because every country is indeed different and requires different measures, and indeed warnings at different moments and has different indicators that might suggest a warning. So in that sense, you see that there's a more contractualist approach emerging, which of course first applies to the current debtor countries. But if you read the Van Rompuy report again, the suggestion is actually to generalize that and that all countries will engage in some kind of contract, policy contract, binding policy contract, sanctionable policy contract with the Commission. It's also still, it's not democratic federalism, it's executive federalism. In the end, it's Merkozy or Merkel or Hollande that are in control. And that has a number of implications. There's no effective parliamentary scrutiny. Certainly not at the European level. The European Parliament is mostly out of this game. But also individual parliaments cannot scrutinize the whole, with the arguable exception of the Bundestag that has, by a combination of factors, been able maybe to strengthen its position. It also means indeed that governments can indeed leave the procedural framework of the EU treaties and move back into international law with all the absence of procedural constraints and indeed power taking over. I mean, basically then the full differences between Greece and Germany come to the fore. And these are in a way contained within the treaty, but they are less, such constraints are not present in the international game. And there's a tendency to depoliticize this. We don't have a political forum where the decisions are taken. So we have to develop standards, a 3% norm, a 0.5% norm, a golden rule, and we have this fetish system of indicators. Because we cannot, there is no political authority to take decisions. We have to kind of have them led by technocrats and automatic mechanisms that kick in when a certain relatively disputable threshold is reached. Now, these are of course problematic situations, so it's no wonder that some people have argued, let's move out of this. Let's move to the only way that we're going to leave the crisis and indeed save some sense of constitutional control, democratic control, parliamentary control, is if we move the game up to the supranational level and install a proper EU economic government. Emerging from this super commissioner of monetary affairs, maybe with a strong precedent on his or her side, merging the positions of Van Rompuy and Barroso. And of course, then you are able to have political parliamentary accountability, either by a more presidential system or to a more parliamentary system. This option comes with redistribution often, fiscal union, mutualization of national debts, and indeed proposes to increase the EU budget, or at least a Eurozone budget. Again, look at the Van Rompuy report, introduce financial transactions tax, bring it revenue directly to the Eurozone, and indeed build budgets to redistribute and to reinvest across Europe. And the following implication thereof, that is of course that you can only make such a jump with a coalition of the willing. It would mean the formation of a core Europe. It would also mean that some countries have a great excuse to reduce their engagement with the Union. I don't have to call names here. Big question with this scenario is very much the people, the actors who have to make this jump are in the end the member states still. And that means that in a way they have to reduce their sovereignty considerably There's a strategic element here. And there's a second risk. I think you can talk about this as a democratic federation, and you can have all the mechanisms of institution building, of elections, of accountability, of presentations. But what if no one turns up? No one cares, no one watches. There's the risk of a democratic facade, because they are not these preconditions of a demos, European demos, constitutional stability. Well, I mean, maybe the party structuring would come. So let's just consider, maybe for the sake of argument, the third solution. I mean, let's face it, if we could start all anew, maybe many member states would have stepped out of this. The thing is that we're stuck into it, and and basically, even if it would be rational to step out of it, we don't know how to do that in a healthy way. So it's bound to be very costly for the state involved. You get all these euro debts that remain denominated in euros, while your own currency, your reintroduced national currency, depreciates. Other EU states have liabilities in the countries, and there will be a kind of a cascading effect, which makes Lehman probably look small. And the cascading effects go beyond the economic logic. They may also have political knock-on effects. We simply don't know what we would be up to, but it might be very, very big, so that we rather don't think about it. And the thing is, of course, that it's very hard to isolate this. It's not just a matter of, let's pull Greece out. If Greece goes, then most estimations are that others will follow. And where does it stop? So where does this leave us? Now look back at the dilemma. I think if you read Roderick, and also I think by most intuitions, but I'd be curious if other intuitions of people have, whether people have different intuitions. If you think about these, which is the biggest value among democracy, national diversity, and monetary integration, then I think most people would say democracy is the deepest value, national diversity has a certain emotional attachment, and monetary integration is actually something that is not a value per se, but rather a way to attain greater economic effectiveness and efficiency. So the order would be, let's save democracy, let's cherish national diversity, and then, logically, we would have to give up on monetary integration. And that's, in a way, also the solution that Roderick has been driving. Not very consistently, but seems to kind of converge on. But that's certainly not the order, the way that it's playing out in Europe. We're in a situation where basically monetary integration is a no-go. Where no one, giving up monetary integration is a no-go. And where there is a major commitment to stick to that, and actually the alternative is not even seriously considered, although I don't rule out the option that sooner or later 1 or 2 or 3 countries will be forced out. But monetary integration, in a way, is there to stay. We're in and we cannot get out. You cannot unscramble the egg. Then the political logic is also that national diversity is bound to stay. Merkel is not going to say, and certainly the Bundesverfassungsgericht will not allow her to say, let's supranationalize the whole thing. Let's give the ultimate authority to an EU government. It's not, and Merkel's not on her own, of course. I mean, I don't think the Dutch government or the Finnish government or the Austrian government will make that move. So there's a political lock in there. And that means, indeed, that democracy is the most vulnerable among the 3, if indeed the dilemma is as strict as it's put up here. And I think, more widely speaking, this is quite typical of where we are with the European Union at large. I mean, I'm always reluctant to tie the fate of EMU to the European Union in general, but I think there's a wider lesson here. We are locked into pooling a big degree of competences, and we don't want to retreat on that. But indeed, we have these persisting national autonomy and identification and political, and indeed the primacy of national democracy over whatever we have at the EU level in terms of democracy. But rather than kind of accept that the dilemma forces us to give up on democracy, of course the European Union asked for a creative solution, and of course I don't have a solution, but I just want to introduce some pointers where maybe there's a way out to negotiate, or at least to muddle through the trilemma, if you like. One is indeed that it's premised on this idea of national autonomy. And not just of one country or of some creditor states. I think if you take that seriously, then we have to create a prospect where countries like the debtor states, typical country Greece, or even Spain or Italy, can at some point regain their national policy autonomy. There has to be a prospect of recovery there. And if we cannot assure that, and I'm not sure we can assure that in all cases, then indeed I think then the only solution is really, but you cannot have a European Union of member states where some are actually not autonomous anymore and others are. So I think there's a duty there to ensure the conditions of national autonomy to some extent, or at least to make any intervention in that transitional. So that's the primacy still of national democracy in a way, in the two-level democratic system. Second thing is that still there is a big problem, I think, in the way that the technocratic way and the apolitical way that the increased centralization of powers has taken place in the crisis. And there I think we really have to work on creating visibility to political choices. And I think politicizing the position of the Commissioner for Monetary Affairs is one way to go there and to consider. And then the third one, which has been a pretty lame remark, I think, and actually has mostly been an excuse for inaction, is that we have to realize that we're working in a multi-level democratic or parliamentary system, or a multi-level parliamentary field, as John Erik Vosseman and I have even quoted it previously. We have to create effective ways and binding ways for national parliaments and European Parliament to coordinate in these things. And particularly, I think, when it comes to these contractual agreements, members of understanding, that parliaments have a role in reviewing these. Thank you.
Ben, that was great. Thank you.